Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's workshop. I'm Ed Bartholomew, Senior Outreach Director for the Broadband Data Task Force at the FCC. As you know, the FCC has developed a new framework for collecting information on broadband service availability, which we call the Broadband Data Collection, or BDC. Born out of the Broadband Data Act, the BDC is a collection of location-level information on fixed broadband service availability throughout the country. A critical input to the BDC is the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, or the common data set of all locations in the United States where fixed broadband service can be installed. By statute, the fabric must serve as the foundation upon which all fixed broadband availability data is reported and overlaid. The first version of the fabric was made available to providers and governmental stakeholders on June 23rd of 2022. And it served as the basis for the inaugural BDC filing period. These data currently populate the pre-production draft of the National Broadband Map, and that's publicly available at broadbandmap.gov. In December, the FCC released the second version of the fabric to licensees and internet service providers. The second BDC filing window, which gathered broadband availability data as of December 30th, 2022, will be overlaid onto the second version of the map and will be made publicly available on the National Broadband Map in the spring. The new National Broadband Map leverages the power of individuals, governmental entities, and other third parties to help validate both locations and broadband availability data on the map. The bulk fabric challenge process is one opportunity for parties who have licensed the fabric to submit challenges to multiple locations, included or not included in the data set. And the results of this challenge process will help to refine the fabric data set for future filing rounds. On January 25th, we announced that for the best opportunity to be included in version 3 of the fabric, challenges to version 2 should be submitted by March 15th of 2023. In that announcement, we also outlined some best practices and guidance to assist bulk fabric challengers with their submissions. During today's technical assistance workshop, we will provide additional guidance to entities who intend to file bulk fabric challenges on how to work with the fabric dataset, including some possible approaches to identifying missing or misidentified locations in the fabric. In addition to presenters from the FCC and CostQuest, we're also joined by Sarah Morris, Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary at NTIA for today's workshop session. We've reserved some time for questions and answers after the presentation, and I would encourage everyone to use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform to submit your questions. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows, and if we're unable to answer your specific question today, you can follow up by submitting a question online at the BDC Help Center, fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. You can also find additional information and resources in the BDC Help Center, as well as a detailed user guide for the BDC system. The website is updated regularly with additional resources and FAQs, and I encourage you to visit the website often throughout this process. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in the workshop today and hope that you will find this helpful. One other thing I wanted to flag before I hand it over to our first presenter is we have made one-on-one sessions available for anyone who is interested. We do have some blocks of time tomorrow afternoon and Wednesday afternoon. And if you're interested in a one-on-one session to go through more specifics, such as examples from the results of the first challenge you submitted, or if you have sort of deeper dive questions that may be unique to your state or your situation, please do reach out and request one of those sessions. We can give you the email address in the chat for you to reach out and try to set one of those up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea Fallon, the Senior Implementation Officer on the Broadband Data Task Force, for the first presentation. Over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Ed. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of what the fabric is. The Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric is a data set of all of the locations, the buildings or structures in the country where mass market broadband internet access service has been or could be installed. It is essentially a list of every residence and small business structure in the country, along with a unique identifier, an address, geographic coordinates, a building type code, unit count, and some other information for each structure. The creation of the fabric was required by the Broadband Data Act and has been developed for the broadband data collection so that the FCC, other government agencies, internet service providers, and the public can all work from a single standardized universal set of locations for the collection and reporting of data on fixed broadband availability. It serves as the denominator in a sense in determining where broadband service is and available and where it is not. Also, when fixed broadband providers file data in the BDC system on their availability as a list of locations, they must use the fabric and specifically the unique identifiers for each location as the basis for that list and that data. In addition, when you go to the National Broadband Map, all of the green and red dots showing the locations on the map are the fabric locations. So next slide. In order to generate the fabric data set, the FCC's fabric contractor, CostQuest Associates, relies on several underlying source data sets. These include parcel data, tax data, address data sets, satellite and aerial imagery, building footprints, roads, and other sources. These data sets are updated by their underlying sources periodically, and CostQuest is always working on improving its data and process to generate each version of the fabric. Availability data as of June 30th, 2022, and version 2, which was used for the latest submission of availability data as of December 31st. CostQuest updated its source data, which resulted in new satellite imagery, building footprint data, assessment information, and parcel boundaries. It modified its address data to improve primary addresses assigned to locations and added more secondary addresses. It improved its statistical models to more accurately select parcels with BSLs and to identify the structures on parcels that are BSLs. And it increased the amount of information that is visually verified to correctly identify BSLs and distinguish multiple BSL parcels from single BSL parcels. I wanted to note that we have posted a video online that describes the method and the process used to generate the fabric. The link is at the bottom of the slide and is also available online at the BDC Help Center under video resources. Next slide. So many of you have probably already gone through the process of getting access to the fabric, but for those of you who haven't, this slide lists out the steps. There is also a help article on the BDC Help Center website, the link is there, that walks through these steps in even more detail. And essentially, you would first log in to the BDC system at bdc.fcc.gov. Fill out the entity information page for your FRN and indicate there that you want to submit bulk challenge or crowdsource data rather than broadband availability data. The FCC will then pass your entity information to CostQuest, and they will send you an email inviting you to register in their system in order to access the fabric. After you submit their license request form, they will review that and generate a license agreement for you to sign. And after you sign that, you will be granted access to a folder to download the fabric data for your relevant geographic area. Next slide. So generating and maintaining a geospatial data set of every broadband serviceable building in the country is not an easy process. It's complicated, very granular, and involves a lot of time-consuming and detailed work. And given the amount of data in the fabric and the complexities involved in creating it, we know that the data set isn't perfect, and as a result, we have a process for accepting challenges or proposed corrections to the fabric. And there are different categories or types of challenges to the fabric, including adding new locations to the fabric or changing the data associated with the locations that are already there, such as the coordinates, the address, the unit count, or the building type. So the most common type of fabric challenge we have received thus far is the type 1 challenge, which is to add a new location to the fabric. And in order to maintain the accuracy and the integrity of the fabric data set and the broadband map that relies on it, we have to have a rigorous process for accepting type 1 challenges into the next version of the fabric. If we were to accept every challenge to add a location that has been submitted to us, we would end up adding locations that are in the middle of a road or where no structure exists. And this would result in the green and red dots that you see on the National Broadband Map showing up in some really silly places, or having multiple dots showing up on the same building. And then this would also force the ISPs to report on whether they serve locations that don't actually exist. So we have to ensure that a new location meets a strict set of criteria before it can be added to the fabric. One, it has to be a BSL, and that means it's a residence or a business that would buy mass market broadband service. So all the various sheds, garages, storage units, or barns across the country are not considered broadband serviceable locations under the FCC rules. 2, a new location should have a unique address that we can validate. 3, it must identify a new structure. Its coordinates can't fall on a building that is an existing BSL, but they do need to fall in a building. And if there's already a BSL on a single residence parcel, we generally cannot add a second one. Next slide, please. So the FCC and CostQuest assess whether a type 1 challenge meets the criteria I've described using a process that is partially automated and partially manual. The automated process involves analyzing the geographic coordinates and address to see if the coordinates are valid, if the point falls on the footprint of a building, if the building it falls on meets certain BSL criteria that can be determined in an automated way, if the building it falls on is already a BSL, if it falls on a parcel that already has a BSL, if the city and state in the address are valid according to the U.S. Postal Service, and other checks. If the point in the type 1 challenge fails any of these tests, then it will not progress in the challenge process. It will be assigned a reason as to why it failed, and the challenger will ultimately be able to see the reason code for that point. If the point successfully passes through all of these automated checks, then it goes through a manual review process. This involves a human looking up imagery for the point, for example, in Google Maps, to see if the point falls on a building that meets those criteria for a BSL that can't be determined through the automated process. So I've been describing the process for accepting type 1 challenges to the fabric. But there are other types of fabric challenges that A, may be more appropriate for what a challenger is trying to accomplish, and B, may have a higher likelihood of being accepted into the next version of the fabric. CostQuest and the FCC still run validations on these types of challenges, but the bar isn't as high as it is to accept type 1 challenges. So for example, we know that on a parcel with many buildings, the fabric sometimes identifies the wrong building as a BSL. So the BSL may be on a barn or garage when it really should be on a house. And if that's the case, the challenger can submit a type 5 challenge to move the point from the wrong building to the right one within the same parcel. Another issue that sometimes appears in the fabric is that the primary address associated with a BSL is incorrect. If that's the case, a challenger can submit a type 2 challenge with the new address that they believe to be correct. In addition, if the primary address appears to be correct, but the challenger knows of an additional address associated with the building, then they can submit a type 7 challenge. Assuming a new address submitted passes certain US Postal Service validation, then it will be accepted. Finally, if a challenger believes the building type code or unit count associated with a location in the fabric to be incorrect, they can submit a type 4 or a type 3 challenge, respectively. The automated checks on these ensure that the unit count change is within a certain parameter, but otherwise, these types of challenges are generally accepted. As a fabric challenger, ensuring that a type 1 challenge in particular meets the various criteria I've described and therefore will be accepted, requires mapping the fabric points in GIS software, working with multiple data sources, and careful GIS analyses. But without all of this, it's hard to ensure that it's appropriate to add that new point to the fabric. To provide more detail on these steps, I'm going to turn it over to John Emmett, a GIS specialist with the Industry Analysis Division. Then Mark Gutman, Vice President with CostQuest, will walk through several tips on how to file a successful fabric challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. So we'd like to show you a pair of short videos demonstrating how to ingest and display fabric data in QGIS. QGIS is a free and open source GIS desktop application. So once QGIS is open, you're going to want to navigate to the layer menu. And hover over Add Layer, and then you'll select Add Delimited Text Layer. From there, you'll navigate to where you have downloaded the fabric file. And you want to ensure that in the geometry definition section that the X field is displaying longitude and the Y field is displaying latitude. Next slide, please. Also in that geometry definition area, you're going to want to make sure that you've selected the correct coordinate system. So in this case, it'll be EPSG 4326 WGS 84. Okay. And then you can click Add. And if you've done everything correctly, you should see a fair amount of points in the display. If you'd like to add a base map, you can go to the XYZ tiles area, and from there you can either OpenStreetMap, which we've done here, or enter a URL for a different type of base mapping. Once you've ingested the fabric points, you can go to the main toolbar and select Display Attribute Data. And this will bring up all the attribute data associated with the file that you have ingested. And you can also draw and select certain points from the fabric. Open the add table, the highlighted ones will be shown. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Gutman from CostQuest.
Thank you very much, John. I'll wait for the slide to reset here. Thank you. Thanks, John. So my name is Mark Gutman. I'm a vice president with CostQuest Associates, and CostQuest is the fabric supplier for the FCC. The FCC Fabric is a geospatial data set, like we've heard, developed from a number of upstream data sources described earlier. This Fabric data set is provided to the FCC and licensed participants of the broadband data collection effort on a semi-annual basis. In regard to the Fabric challenges, the FCC adjudicates those through automated and manual steps. A number of these steps require access not only to the Fabric, but also to the underlying sources that create the Fabric. This includes the parcels, the footprints, and the address data. Given the need to test against these source data sets that are not provided to the FCC, CostQuest supports the FCC with geospatial analysis related to the challenge process. As part of this work, we're also able to analyze challenge results and identify common issues where we think organizations can modify the structure of their challenge efforts to make a more effective and successful challenge submission. Going back to what Ed had mentioned in his introduction, the challenge process is intended to harness the power of individuals, governmental entities, and other third parties to validate the Fabric and broadband availability data. Our intent over the next few slides is to walk through some of the more common opportunities for improvement we see in submitted challenges. Our hope is that these examples provide a way for you and your organization to build a more efficient mechanism for challenge development. And one last thing before we get into the slides, as the Fabric is a geospatial data set, developing Fabric changes is inherently a geospatial process. What we found is that organizations that rely on just textual comparisons of addresses to identify type 1, those add BSL challenges, have had limited success with their challenge submission. A critical last test for that challenge submission is a geospatial review using a GIS program, as John showed. Looking at each submitted challenge type on the map is always very helpful. And now on to a couple examples. Because most of the challenges we've received to date have been for adding DSLs, our examples will mainly focus on that challenge type. Keep in mind that the examples, the images we present are representatives. Our goal is to present general observations rather than case-by-case data determinations. There may be unique circumstances in any one particular challenge. So now on to those examples. On the slide 8 we have in front of us, we find a challenge location. The place mark icon for that challenge is inside of the yellow oval. And just to orient you to the symbology in the map, the orange polygons represent the building footprints. The blue circles are Fabric location records. Triangles represent geospatial locations from address data sources. And the key takeaway from the slide is that the location provided for the challenge is falling in the road. According to the FCC guidelines, as Chelsea mentioned, the guidelines for adjudication, this challenge will be rejected due to the failure to actually identify a BSL. And as you look at the slide, you'll also notice that several of our address data sources, the triangles, are landing directly on the road. As I'll cover in the next slide, this is a common issue if you source your challenge using street address geocoding engines to locate addresses you feel are missing in the Fabric. So next slide, please. So the first question to ask is if you find a portion of your challenge data landing on or near the center line of the road rather than on a structure. These challenges are typically not successful. In some cases, challenge data that are sourced from street address geocoders will place locations on or closely to a road. In other cases, some E91 data that identifies driveway locations or is linear referenced, so that is a distance away from the beginning or the end of a road, will also place address locations near roads and not on the structures. And one way that you can identify this is by searching your challenge data for challenge points within a proximity of a road center line. This could be a buffered distance query within a GIS. If you do identify those road placement issues, I'd suggest you undertake a manual effort to align the challenge location to a structure that is not in the Fabric and that you have knowledge of it representing a broadband serviceable location. So next slide, please. On the next slide, we'll ask a similar question to the road question. Is that challenge point falling on a structure? If a type 1 challenge isn't falling on a structure, the nature of the challenge may not be in addition to the fabric. The location used for this challenge could be wrong, or the challenge may imply a move, so a type 5 challenge. So what may be necessary is a movement, a type 5 challenge, to move the fabric point from what might be the garage or detached carport over to the structure. So this might be a move situation instead of an add situation, a type 1 or a type 5 instead of a type 1. And let me also point out something else on this slide. If you assume that the red points in the northwest of the map, so directly above that oval, are challenge points, those points are falling on vacant land. Vacant land frequently has an address, but by definition, there's nothing on it. So there's no BSL there. So challenges against vacant land also tend not to be very successful. Next slide, please. So the summary takeaway from this example is, if you're adding a BSL, does that location that you're adding fall onto a BSL? And a visual inspection is the best way to find that out. Next slide, please. And remember, of course, that the challenge record must fall on the location of an existing BSL and not on a building within a parcel that already has a BSL. Some specific examples of the second case is when we see sheds, detached garages, and carports submitted as type 1 challenges. So one of the more complex areas of challenge is understanding new builds, which is what we're looking at on this slide. By new builds, what we're referring to is new construction of houses or buildings, which are or may become BSLs. As you can see on the slide, in the bottom portion, there's a new development being built. In most cases, there are BSLs identified where we have assessment information and footprints that indicate a structure and improvement value on the land. Visually, as you move toward the northeast portion of the development, there are lots parceled out, but no structures have been completed. This will not likely be a successful area of challenge. Keep in mind, by its nature, identification and consideration of new construction is driven by where you are in time. In many cases, when we process the fabric, we'll have imagery and footprints that don't show a structure, but assessment information that will indicate a structure exists. That is, it has improvement value in the tax assessment information. The model logic should capture the location as BSLs come on over time. However, if our imagery parcel and assessor data lag, we may miss new construction that has not been completed, or that has been completed. I apologize. Next slide, please. In summary, add BSL challenges in areas of new construction are complex due to the difference in vintages of our input data sources. The fabric will typically not recognize a BSL where there isn't evidence of a structure and improvement. Over time, as construction proceeds and data sources update, the fabric will recognize those BSLs. And we also see similar examples where in areas of demolition or natural disaster, imagery may point to the presence of a BSL, but improvement value indicates that structures have been removed. In those circumstances also, add BSL challenges will likely not be successful. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see a fabric location within an entity boundary. An entity boundary is a polygon representing a college, university, prison, or military base. As described in the methodology, all fabric demand within an entity boundary is aggregated into a single location. There may be multiple records within the fabric to represent the community anchor institution, the housing unit demand, or the group quarters. But for each record, each location ID, that is, will be at the same location with different building type codes and potentially different unit values. Entity boundary sources are described in section 3 of the methodology, available within CostQuest Help Desk. Polygons can be downloaded from either the US Census or the National Map, depending on the type of entity boundary. Those polygons can be used for further interrogation of the challenge data. Next slide, please. Inconsistent with the adjudication rules developed by the FCC, an add BSL challenge that falls inside of an entity boundary will be rejected. And next slide, please. So the next slide gives an example of a military base, another type of entity boundary, and how it's handled. The logic is similar to the college and university. As you can see in the southeast portion of the map, the fabric location for the Peterson Space Force Base is shown. The larger circle shows a housing development within that base. Because the housing unit development falls within the entity boundary, it can't be a source of additional BSLs. Within entity boundaries, you can challenge to modify unit counts, but you can't add more BSLs within that boundary. Next slide, please. Military bases are handled similarly to prisons, colleges, and universities. On-base housing, either housing units or barracks, which would represent group quarters, should not have individual BSLs added as challenges. All the fabric locations will be represented by that single point within the entity boundary. Next slide, please. And we also receive a number of add BSL challenges related to multi-unit buildings, like those shown on the slide in front of us. Although there can be exceptions, and again, this may be data dependent. Typically, if you find a multi-unit building, an apartment building or a condominium that lacks a BSL on a single structure, you could use a type 1 challenge to add a BSL to that building. That's what the call out at the top portion of the slide is indicating. For the most part, you could use patterns of similar buildings nearby to determine if this building should have its own BSL. In the example shown on the slide, all of the buildings are of comparable size and shape. They should probably all have their own fabric point, which they do. You may not want to make the same assumption with a factory complex, for example, owned by a single entity. A factory complex with a number of small buildings may not need BSLs on each building. What we'll try to do is indicate the BSL on the largest structure. That might be the factory, but we don't try to put BSLs on parking structures, storage buildings, ancillary structures of that nature. This slide also points to the addition of a secondary address on the lower left portion of the bottom. Because multiple distinct addresses may be captured within a single multi-unit building, not units like unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, and unit 4, but different address numbers, it can be important to associate those secondary addresses with the structure. A type 7 challenge is used to add new secondary sources to those structures. Next slide, please. So in summary, with the multi-unit buildings, if an existing fabric point is on or close to the building, don't file a type 1 challenge. If the address is incorrect, use a type 2 challenge to update the address. And we'll touch a little bit more on that shortly. If there are additional addresses that should be added to the BSL, use a type 7 challenge. And if the unit count is incorrect, use a type 3 challenge. Next slide, please. Although we've mentioned, we haven't discussed previously how to modify an address in the fabric. And this slide covers address modification. Many of the type 1 challenges we see are probably intended to be address modifications rather than additions of new BSLs. So if you want to modify an address, the process varies based on the situation you're in. Let's walk through the process and keep in mind that the process is driven by the fact that an address cannot duplicate in the fabric. So your first test is what the major bullet is indicating. Is the address you wish to modify already existing with an existing BSL in the fabric? If it does, then you have two choices. You can either correct the address, so this is the address on the point that you want to remove from, or you can null that address out. Either of those two answers, if you will free up the address so it can be used in your next step. Once that is accomplished, your address is freed up, like I said. Now, if the BSL you want to associate that address with already exists in the fabric, you can use a type 2 challenge to add that address onto that point. Or if that BSL doesn't yet exist in the fabric, you could use a type 1 challenge to add the BSL and then add the address that you freed up. So please keep in mind one important thing. These challenges all need to be within the same challenge ticket. So the removals of the address, the freeing up step, if you will, has to be within the same challenge ticket as the addition if you're bringing in a new BSL. And with that, I hope that the examples that we provided are helpful to you in submitting successful challenges. And I will turn it back to Ed at this point.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Chelsea and John. We do have a couple questions and I wanted to kind of get those rolling. So John, I think the first one you may be in a good position to tackle for us, and that's what types of geoprocessing operations can be used to test type 1 challenges?
Sure, Ed. So there are several options. This will be driven by the type of challenge you're analyzing and the data you have. We mentioned earlier a road buffer distance test to identify and analyze the points that fall within proximity to roads. You could also run a similar analysis on entity boundaries. After you download the source polygons, a selection of potential challenge points intersecting those polygons will tell you if there are any entity boundary issues. If you have a source of building footprints, you could also test to see if your challenge points fall within those footprints. If you don't have footprints, you could run a distance analysis to determine how many potential add-BSL challenges fall within a given proximity of an existing fabric point. The proximity analysis will be driven by the data you have, as well as location density of your submission. We've used samples of records to determine where the appropriate distance cutoffs may be.
Thanks for that. And I know building footprints have come up a couple times during today's discussion. Is there an open source repository of building footprints?
Sure, there are a couple of places you could consider looking. You could consider using OpenStreetMap. The acronym for that is OSM. The OSM data can be used as a base map and pulled into a GIS like QGIS or ArcGIS. Using the OSM as a base map will allow for visual review of challenges. You can also download the data directly. There are a number of open source applications available to make the download easier. Also, several years ago, Microsoft released a nearly national building footprint database. Those data are available on GitHub. Finally, you could also consider looking at a state or county open data portal or spatial data repository. As with all data, there's no guarantee as to the timeliness or quality of the data. Just because something is a footprint, it may not be a BSL. Raw footprint data will pick up many structures that aren't BSLs.
Thanks, John. Mark, wanted to throw one your way. Wondering if you can help us out with how can we tell if an address is derived from a street geocoder?
Yeah, sure. So there are probably a couple ways to do this. First, if you have the raw data output, most address geocoders add a field, or most geocoders add a field to tell you the source of the provided latitude and longitude. That sometimes is referred to as a quality or a match type. It varies from vendor to vendor. What you'll tend to see are either textual values or codes that indicate if something is an address representing a street address, or a street name representing a road, a city centroid, a zip code, etc. These are all indications of non-structure level assignments. If you don't have the source information, a visual review of the data is helpful. In a visual review, you're looking for things like, are the points landing on structures? If not, are they landing on the road? If they're not landing on the road, are they landing at nearly consistent distance from what the roads from the road? Also, you'll probably see them bunched up, depending on the geocoder at the beginning of street segments, or for addresses that the geocoder has difficulty finding, you'll find lots and lots of addresses, all with the exact same latitude and longitude, a zip code placement situation. So those are the kind of artifacts, those are the kind of clues you'd see if you're using street geocoded source data.
And Chelsea, I know we talked a little bit about a type 7 challenge and how that can be used to add a secondary address. Maybe talk a little bit more about what secondary addresses are.
Sure. So a secondary address is basically another valid address that's associated with a structure. This can arise from two different situations. One is a building that has multiple entrances where each entrance faces a different street and then would have a different address associated with it. The other situation is a single structure that has multiple distinct addresses. This tends to happen where multiple unique street addresses, not unit numbers, are associated with a given structure. This can happen with townhomes, condos, office and high density buildings with a mixture of businesses and residences. So the active table in the Fabric dataset has one primary address associated with each location ID. And then the Fabric overall includes a secondary address file that includes all of the additional addresses that we're able to validate for each structure in the active file. And wanted to note that the secondary address table won't necessarily capture cases where a street has multiple names, however.
So can you or John maybe tell us a little bit more about how those secondary addresses can be used by people working with the Fabric dataset?
It's sure thing, Ed. So our intent with the secondary address table is to support address matching. Each Fabric point has a single primary address in the active locations Fabric file, but there are cases where other data sources indicate multiple addresses are associated with that location. The secondary address table could be used as a way to join back from these extra addresses to the relevant Fabric location ID. We've tried to set up the address table so it's friendly to both a relational database as well as a geocoding data source.
Thanks for that. And I know during the presentations, we talked about a couple different types of Fabric challenges. Chelsea, can you kind of summarize the list of all the different types and tell us a little bit about what they're designed to do?
Sure, I can walk through those. There are 7 types of potential challenges, and we do have another help article on our online BDC Help Center that also walks through this. So the type 1 challenge, which I talked about quite a bit, is the missing broadband serviceable location. This is where you'd be looking to add a new record to the Fabric. Type 2 is the incorrect location address. This challenge can be used to modify the primary address of an existing record in the Fabric. Type 3 or category 3 is an incorrect location unit count. And this challenge can be used to modify the unit count, basically the number of residential or non-residential units contained within the structure that's in the Fabric. Type 4 is the incorrect location building type code. This challenge can be used to update the building type code, basically changing the flag indicating whether a location is a BSL flag of false to true, to indicate that the location may actually be served with mass market broadband service. Type 5 challenge is the location is not within the correct building footprint. This would be used to move a BSL to a correct building footprint or the correct structure on the same parcel if the wrong one was identified as the BSL. Type 6 is a location is not broadband serviceable. This challenge can be used to indicate if a location doesn't require mass market broadband, if it doesn't have electricity, or it doesn't require a network location, basically that it should not be considered a BSL for a particular reason, and the different reasons are listed in the data specification. And then lastly, the type 7 is to add a supplemental address. This can be used to add a secondary address associated with a BSL that's already in the Fabric, and as John mentioned, can be helpful to support address match.
Thanks for that. Mark, wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the data sources that are used to identify when the BSL flag is set to false.
Sure. So there's a couple different data sources that we use in that determination, and we try to document them in section 3 of the methodology, and I think a link went out for where that is. So the first are the entity boundaries. We talked about those in terms of the challenges earlier. And next, we have the sources for the community anchor institutions. Those data sets come from mainly Highfield, Homeland Security Infrastructure Foundation level data sets. So those identify things like schools, libraries are identified from different sources. So those are all point level data sets that we use. Hospitals are in there, law enforcement and government buildings as well are in those data sets. Lots of times you'll find those things co-located. Schools and libraries tend to be very co-located, so they tend to bunch. And then the last data set that we use to identify what we call enterprise locations, those are locations not requiring mass market services. That is a business business database that we use. Within that business database, it has a combination of an estimate of employment and the NAICS code. The NAICS code is a standardized classification scheme for business. So there's a table within the methodology that describes the intersection of those two things. And when, based on that intersection, we identify a record as enterprise. So those are the 3 or 4 classes of data sets we use for that determination.
John, turning things back to you for a minute. Where's the null address flag? And is that something that's within the provided CSV for the address location challenge?
So the null address flag is a required field in the bulk fabric data specification to indicate that the location you are filing does not have an address. Generally, it should be only used when a location truly lacks an address, but as Mark spoke to, it can be useful for freeing up an address as an interim step.
Okay. And then pivoting a little bit, we've gotten a lot of questions about CAIs and sort of their role in the fabric. Wondering if maybe Mark could come back and join us to talk a little bit about how CAIs are defined in the fabric and how that's sort of different from the business residential or business and residential building types within the data set.
Sure. So there's a couple of things going on here. So first, the commission, as a general rule, I should say, determined that CAIs are more likely to take enterprise or non-mass market services. So they're not considered BSLs. So one thing is, in this version 2, when we distribute the fabric files, we split out what we consider the BSL records from the non-BSL records. So there's 2 distinct CSV files. The one that contains, I think it's named non-BSL or no BSL at the end, that's going to have records that have a building type code of C for community anchor institution or E for enterprise. So those are non-BSL locations. So I would use the BSL flag, or I'm sorry, I would use the building type code flag to identify those records that are either C or E building type codes. They're only in that one file. If you're looking in the BSL file, you would only see business residential building type codes within that. So the distinction is kind of where you look as far as where they are found in the fabric output files.
And I know we've heard from some libraries and other folks in this community anchor institution space who do in fact take mass market broadband services. Chelsea, is requesting a change to the building type code the right way to go about making sure that that location is reflected correctly?
Yes, that's correct. That would be the type 4 challenge, to change the building type code. And if you change it to either business or residential or both, building that's both has businesses and residences in it, that's the type X, then that would indicate that the something that is a CAI actually does take mass market or would take mass market broadband internet access service and should be considered a BSL. So yes, that would be the way to do that. And we are planning to put out an additional help article kind of spelling out the specific steps on that and more guidance that shortly.
So I think that brings us to the end of all the questions that we had submitted for today's session. So I want to again thank Chelsea, John, and Mark for helping out today and doing different parts of the presentation. As a reminder, you can find a variety of technical assistance materials, including knowledge base articles, FAQs, and other resources by visiting fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. Once you're there, you will see a submit a request button, and you can submit a request for additional support from our technical assistance team using that option. Also wanted to thank Sarah Morris from NTIA for joining us today and being available for this session. And again, just thanks to all the folks who attended for taking your time to participate in the webinar and for your efforts to engage with the broadband data collection and the National Broadband Map. We look forward to continued conversations and your continued participation. Thank you.